So what was responsible in the Industrial Revolution? There's a whole chain of events and discoveries and ideas that come about in the West that lead us towards the Industrial Revolution and that are all necessary for the Industrial Revolution to actually happen. The Industrial Revolution is dependent on, I think really two fundamental ideas that come out of the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, and really the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. The two ideas are reason and individualism. And individualism, I lump in political freedom, the idea of political freedom, and the idea of individuals as having rights. Reason is this notion that we are competent in knowing reality and understanding reality with our senses. Our senses are valid, and we can know reality and we can manipulate what's happening in the world around us in predictable ways. And of course, that understanding, that idea of reason leads to science. And you couldn't have had the Industrial Revolution without the Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution is a consequence of the bringing back of reason into Western civilization. It kind of got lost. Aristotle, big advocate of logic and reason, and you go through a dark ages, and Aristotle's brought back into Western civilization in somewhere around the 14th century. And at some point, this leads to, not accidentally, to a scientific revolution. And whether it's Copernicus and Galileo, and ultimately Newton, and the rest of the science that goes through the 18th and 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution, which is basically a two-pronged revolution, it is a political revolution, it's an engineering business revolution, dependent on the scientific revolution. So you can't have the invention of the steam engine and railroads and ultimately airplanes at the end of the Industrial Revolution, and everything in between, and industrialization of factories and automated sewing machines and all this stuff. None of this stuff could happen without first there being science, and without respect for science and admiration for science, and without this idea that we can't in predictable ways manipulate reality. That is, without reason, without a huge respect for reason, and bring everything before reason. That idea, which I think Jefferson articulates so well, that idea of the power of reason is what drives the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the idea that I can build a machine and it will continue to work, and it's predictable what kind of products it'll make, and that there are markets out there that I can predictably price. So the whole science of economics, the whole science of business, the whole science of manufacturing, all those come out of reason and science. But none of that can exist. None of that can happen unless people are free. Free to innovate, free to develop, free to manufacture, free to hire, free to sell, free to buy. Right? Without the existence of a marketplace, a free marketplace in which innovation and all this can happen, the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen. So you need science and reason, and then you need... Now, these are not unrelated, right? You can't get political freedom without reason. So the idea of political freedom, the idea of the autonomy of the individual, and the reason the individual is autonomous, because reason resides within the individual in a sense, right? We are reasoning entities. Collectives don't reason. Individuals reason. So we are autonomous. We have rights. Government is there to serve us by protecting our rights. That's the purpose of government. So whether it was explicitly articulated that way as it was in the American Revolution, or whether it was implicit as it was in England, or implicit as it was in many of the European countries, at least to some degree. It wasn't completely a notion of individual rights like it was in America, but it was implicitly. And I think America developed faster because it was explicit. The Industrial Revolution was more successful than anywhere else in America because it was explicit. And the second place was England because it was semi-explicit. It was almost there. And remember, those thinkers of the Enlightenment that developed these political theories were primarily British and Scottish, or English and Scottish. So two ideas. Reason science, that's one idea. Political freedom is the second idea. Both of those ideas come together in the late 18th century. Again, the defining moment is the Declaration of Independence in the United States, and they manifest themselves in this explosion of innovation, of increased production, of increased efficiency, of increased standard of living, of the creation of a middle class, of explosion of city populations, but at the same time a huge increase in the productivity of farming, huge increase in the productivity of food creation to feed all these people in the city. So the 19th century is one of the maybe the most miraculous, and I don't mean miraculous in the mystical sense, the most miraculous, misunderstood or least understood centuries in human history, but it is unbelievable what happens during that period. And unfortunately, most of the rhetoric about what happens in the Industrial Revolution has been defined by the left and by the progressives, by the anti-capitalists. And one of, I think, the goals of a pro-capitalist agenda needs to be to recapture the 19th century, to redefine it and re-explain it and redescribe it, describe what really happened. But to answer the question, reason, political freedom.